All right, in this chapter, we're going to talk about authentication bypass using SQL injection. This is one of the most interesting features of SQL injection. It's my favorite thing to do with SQL injection because it's the easiest and sweetest thing to do with SQL injection. It lets you get past authentication applications with a very easy and simple solution. So to get familiar with how to bypass authentication, we first need to know what authentication is, the query that's used for authentication, how we bypass it, and how we exploit it. We're also going to see a live demo of bypassing authentication. So to bypass authentication, we first need to know what authentication is. Authentication is the process that confirms a user's identity. So it's sort of different from authorization, and it's important to note this. Authentication just lets the application know who a user is. So when you log in into an application, the system just understands you're this particular user and makes sure that you're that person. Authorization is the process of checking whether that certain user has access to do something. So authentication does not do that. It just makes sure that you are this particular username, and it does it by making sure that you have the password to access that username. So authentication is making sure that this person is this particular person, not what access he has. So we usually see this as login forms on web applications. It's not very complicated. And if someone has the username and the password, then we can assume in the web application that this is the particular person that we want to authenticate. So this login page can be on different URLs. It usually is at login, at panel, at admin page. But some systems have a different login page for their administrators versus the typical users. And that's actually an authorization thing. But regardless, anywhere that we see a login page, that's an authentication mechanism in an application. And many of the more modern applications generally have a centralized authentication module, which makes it a little harder to attack them because they're generally more secure. But regardless if they're vulnerable to SQL injection, we can get past that. So this is the simple query used in applications to check credentials using SQL. It says select star from users, where username is admin and password is 12345. And those admin and password parts are coming from the user input. So if this query succeeds, we can assume that there's this username in the database, and thus we can log them in. But if this query fails, as in returns no result, we can know that this username and password pair is not correct. We do not return whether only the username or only the password are correct in web applications because that's a security breach on its own. It leaks usernames and leaks passwords. And this is the typical query that's used to check the username and password in systems. And the important thing is that it only checks whether at least one user with this information exists. It doesn't check for how many of it exists, but as soon as one exists, it works. All right, let's see how we can bypass the authentication. So as I said before, the user credentials are only correct if the username and password entered are found in a database. So the condition of the SQL query, which comes after the where statement, should be true. As long as it's true, we're going to get logged in, regardless of how many users we find or what the condition is. And that's the key we're going to use. So if we match with one row, it means the user exists. If we match with 0 rows, it means the user does not exist. But the trick is if we match with more than one row, then we still have a user that exists. So the way we want to do it is we want to turn this query into select star from users, where username is admin and password is the entry password, and then add this part at the end of it, which is or 1 equals 1. that would make us log in regardless of what the password and username is, because the condition of that where clause would be true regardless of what the username and password is, because it's being ORed with a true, and anything OR true is true. And that's how we want to bypass this SQL injection, this authentication mechanism using SQL injection. All right, let's get to how we actually make this happen. All right, so to exploit it, we actually need to provide the password that's in red characters here. So keep in mind that there should be a dash dash space. The space is important in MySQL, otherwise the comments will not work. And we have to match the single quotes as well. Based on how the application uses quotes, we have to do the same thing. Let's get to the demo. Okay, we're gonna see a demo together on how to bypass authentication. This vulnerability exists in the simple e-document application, which is in the login form part. Let's first load up the simple document application. There's a login form, as you can see here, which requires a username and password. And if you don't know it and you enter something, it gives you the wrong username and password. If you take a look at the source code of this page, we can see that it says let's start from e.php users, where username is the entered username and password is the entered password. So this seems vulnerable to SQL injection because this query is directly used. So if we do a single quote, you can see that there's an error in the output. Okay, so it kind of proves that it's vulnerable to SQL injection. So let's see how the query will be after we inject. Let's see what the input will cause. So as you can see, this query will then be true and return all the users in the database, because it says regardless of what the username is, you just return every row because the condition is true, and then comment out the rest of the actual thing. Let's not save this because we want it to still be vulnerable. So this is the query that we want to do. Keep in mind that to have a space after the dash dash. And as you can see, it says login OK. And ironically, it says that your username is single quote or 1=1 dash dash. So the username that you entered is used by the application instead of the username that's found in the database. It can be different in different applications, but for this particular application, this is how it gets the user. And that's how authentication bypass is done.